For this canvas, I have applied 2 coats of gesso and then sanded it so that I had a nice smooth finish. I then used a water-soluble graphite pencil to draw out everything. And the reason that I went with the water-soluble graphite is that way as I painted, that graphite got worked out into the paint versus having a heavy graphite line with a normal pencil that you wouldn't be able to get rid of. So I'm starting with this base layer of gray. I want this stormy sky. And I am mixing water in with my paint. I'm using Mars Black and Titanium White for the sky. Now the palm trees are going to cover a lot of this. Here's the thing. You don't want to try to paint in your palm tree or draw in the palm tree and then paint around it because acrylic dries too fast. If you want your background to be smooth and to actually feel like it's a background and that you didn't just paint around a tree, you want to paint it separately and layer like this. So I just pretend that that palm tree is not even going there and get the sky done as close or as perfect as I can get it. So I'm taking heavier black and adding it on top, and it's mixing with the lighter gray that's already on the canvas. I'm going to spray water with my airbrush to keep it wet. This lets me have time to blend because it does start to dry very fast. And I do have people ask me all the time about the extenders for acrylic to make them dry slower. I hate them. It gunks up the paint weird. I don't know any professional acrylic painters whose work looks how I want mine to look that use that stuff. So I avoid it completely and I just use the airbrush to mist water. This will allow me to keep that wet for as long as I want. And I'm using a mop brush. It's actually a makeup brush. I linked it in my recent newsletter. That specific one is available over on Amazon. It is my favorite mop brush and it's better than the paint brushes that I had used before because it doesn't shed. Regular paint brushes that are mop brushes shed so bad. So I'm drying that off. I've got to make sure that it is completely dry before I go on to my next layer. Now I could have sat and continuously messed with this without drying it, just kept building up the clouds while it was still wet. The reason that I didn't is this is just my base to cover the white of the canvas. I just want to get that white out of there and I will really start from here. I touch it to feel if it's dry or not, knowing that this is not going to be my last layer. If it were wet and I pulled paint off with my finger, no big deal. But if this was possibly going to be my last layer, I would not use my fingers to touch it to test if it was dry. Now I've got to let that canvas cool off a little bit. The reason that I want to let that cool off before I start painting, I'm feeling it now to see if it's still hot. If it's hot, the paint's going to dry that much faster. I don't want that with acrylic, so I need to make sure that it's cooled off. So I'm starting by blocking in the light section of the clouds. Again, I've got water mixed in with this. Now I should say there is a difference between using a glazing medium and using the extender mediums. The extenders are the one that tends to gunk it up trying to keep it so that it doesn't dry so fast. The glazing medium, it adds more gloss to it than I like for while I'm actually painting, but glazing mediums are definitely a decent option. I know lots of artists who like working with those. They tend to add a lot of gloss. I prefer to keep my gloss for after I've photographed it because it's really hard to photograph something like this that does have a high gloss to it. That and the charcoal pencils don't stick to the higher gloss finishes. And you'll see later where I'll use the charcoal pencil to draw in my trees. So I've blocked everything in again, and you can see I've kind of done little half circles or little smiley faces. I'm going to mist that with water. Now there is a balance. You're going to have to get used to how much water versus how much paint, how wet everything is in order to get the look that you want. It does take practice. Don't get frustrated with it. Once you get the hang of it, here you can see I didn't have enough water on there. I was starting to get almost a dry brush feel. So I'm adding water with that airbrush. Now I can go ahead and go back with my mop brush. With the mop brush, I'm holding my hand at the very back of the handle. I'm doing really light little half circles, kind of brushing it in all directions. The goal here is not to blend your colors. The goal is to get rid of your brush strokes or soften your brush strokes. So I will have to continuously take that brush and wipe it off on a paper towel to clean it, which you're not seeing. But I am wiping the paint off of that as I work because if it gets wet, you actually create brush strokes. If you're creating brush strokes with your mop brush, one of two things is happening. Either you're pushing too hard or the brush has picked up too much paint, and so it starts smearing around that paint. So if you are creating brush strokes, those are things to be aware of. Or I guess there's a third option. If you have too much water and too much paint on the canvas, if it's really wet, then you'll just kind of make the paint slide around. It doesn't blend or soften out like what I'm trying to get here. But again, that's just going to take practice. There's not a perfect formula that I can give you. It's just if you've got too much water on with just straight water, then you'll want more paint or let it set and dry a little bit. You just have to get used to it. You can see I'm just making random shapes in here for my clouds. I don't want them to look like baked potatoes, so I've got to make sure I've got these sections that come up a little bit higher on the top. Oh good, now I want a baked potato. But I can keep building and building like this until I get the clouds exactly how I want. Now my other mop brush was starting to get too wet and the paint's starting to dry. I don't have time to clean that brush and then go back and get it dry in time before I needed to blend this out. So I've got a separate mop brush that I use that was clean, that's kind of my backup brush. I don't like it as much, the handle's too heavy, but it's my backup brush for if my other one gets too dirty while I'm blending a wet area. Now I went ahead and dried that layer off, and I'm going to put an additional layer. And the great thing with this, if you have a layer where you're like, well, I don't love this where it looks now, but I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up and make it worse if I do another layer, no big deal. You just can keep layering and painting over it until you get it how you like. Don't give up so soon thinking, well, it's not how I wanted it, but I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. Then mess it up if you have to. You're not learning if you're not experimenting and taking those steps, being bold and trying those scary things. I mean, my last layer was technically fine. I'm not guaranteed my next layer is going to look very good, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to try it because it still wasn't quite what I wanted. I needed more water here. Now what I'm doing, I'm blending these dark areas over areas that are already dry. So I've got to get water on the canvas so that it blends, so that it acts like wet into wet, even though it's wet over dry paint. But by putting the water around it, I can soften those edges up. I chose to go with this cloudy sky because the colors that I'm using, I knew I was going to hang this one in my living room too. The colors there are teal. I know you guys are shocked, but I'm using the teal and then the green and the palm trees. And I wanted a background that was really going to make those two colors just stand out. And the gray really will do it for me. I mean, you can use a blue sky or even a teal sky, but it's not going to make the water glow as much. It's just the contrast of being up against the black and white that is going to make those colors really pop. So here's an area you can see my clouds have basically gotten worse than some of where I was at a little bit earlier. But I'm just going to keep blending and keep messing with it until it gets where I want it. As long as I keep misting that water, I can continuously come back through and adjust the shape while this whole layer is wet, which gives me that nice soft look. So this is going to look a lot more like oils. If you're working in oils, this guy is going to be so easy for you. You just want to make sure you let it dry before you paint the palm tree. But if I were working in oils, I would actually do the same thing as far as my application of where the lights and the darks go, but I would probably be able to do it in one layer and then just very softly blend with the mop brush. Now I do use a different mop brush for oils. I use one by Soft Grip, I believe is what it's called. I've linked them before. Those ones, they shed, but with oil, you've got time to pick the hair out. And I just like the texture. I like the stiffness of the brush. Well, stiffness versus softness. It's just a nice balance for oil. I've been happy with it. But again, they shed, so you have to pick them out, pick the hairs out a lot. can see that wasn't starting to blend very well, so I've got to take the airbrush and mist some water. If you're using the mop brush and nothing is happening, your paint is not wet enough. Again, I'm not trying to blend the colors together here. I'm just trying to get rid of my brush strokes. Soften it out. If I want to actually blend two colors together, like really blend them together, I'm going to use my regular paintbrush, not a mop. I'm twisting and turning that brush just to make sure I'm getting different shapes in there. I don't want every single brush stroke in this cloud or these clouds to look the same. So I kind of turn the brush on its side, twist it around, but it forces variation, which is really important when you're drawing or painting clouds. I often do the same when I'm painting trees or bushes. I will keep twisting and turning that brush so that I get that variation. I'm using thick white paint. It's turning gray. I didn't actually mix gray. It's turning gray because of the wet paint that's already on the canvas. So I just use straight white, and I'm wanting to brighten this area up. If you don't have an airbrush, you can use the little hobby kits. They're about $30 or $35. You can get them on Amazon. Badger makes one. And they're not good for painting because they're single action, but they're great just to mist water. You get that nice fine mist. A lot of people will suggest that you use or ask if you can use a spray bottle. The droplets are too big, and so if I were to take that spray bottle on here and if a heavy droplet comes out, it's going to cause whatever paint is already on the canvas to lift, and I'm going to have to completely repaint it. It is not worth the trouble to try and use a spray bottle. The only time I'll really use a spray bottle is for murals where it's so big that if there's a small droplet, no one's really going to notice. But for smaller paintings like this, you can completely ruin whatever it is that you're working on by using a spray bottle. The mist is just not uniform enough. So here you can see I've switched over to my backup mop brush because the other one was starting to get wet. Now notice as I fan and all of this out, I go right over the white that's already on the canvas. I am not worried about that. One of the reasons that I'm starting with my sky is I can blend into where the water and where the hills in the background are going to go, and I don't have to worry about it because they're not painted already. Had I painted the water first, I would have been having a really hard time blending this sky and not getting that fuzzy, the brush wiping over the water where you can see here how it kind of looks fuzzy against that white border. That is why I will always do whatever is farthest in the back and work my way forward. That way I can blend, I can be messy. I don't have to worry about messing up my subject. Now, sure, I could have used Frisket and blocked everything off or tape to block it off, but if I paint this way, I don't need to, and I would rather save the time. Now, on to these little mountain ranges. The funny thing is, I love how these mountain ranges came out, but I ended up completely covering them with the palm tree. But I would rather make sure that I have them painted well so whatever peeks through with the palm tree still looks good, because I didn't know exactly where that tree was going to cover. So the safest bet for me was just to go ahead and paint these mountains exactly how I would if no tree was going in front of them. But I did end up putting more detail than ended up showing by a lot as I worked on. Now the mountain in the back, you can see I've got that the first little, I want to call it a triangle even though it's not, but the first peak, that one is a medium gray that's very similar to the sky in the background. That's because it's such a similar tone or value, it's going to look like it's farther away. And I'm going to darken everything up as I move forward. And I will start adding greens and yellows into this as well. This is just my base. And here, I don't care if my brush strokes show because I'm going to be putting so much paint over them. I'm just getting that white of the canvas covered up. Okay, I dried those mountains and now I'm coming on top of it with my green tones. Now with this one in the background, I still want it to have a very grayish tone. So I'm using this yellowy color, the yellow and green together, mixed with gray. Anytime you want a grayish color, an easy way to get that is to start with your black and white, mix your gray, and then mix a little bit of whatever color you want in with it. I'm letting my brush strokes stay here. Going a little bit darker on the next mountain peak. Now when you draw mountains, make sure you're not just drawing a bunch of triangles. That looks terrible every time. It will always look terrible. Don't draw triangles. You can see I've got variation in the shape of these mountains. Also notice that the one in the background, how I've got it to where it kind of fades out into the clouds. I don't have a real harsh line where one starts and stops. When you're painting, if you want things to have a natural feel, pay attention to what lines and what edges you want harsh and what should be soft. That one in the distance, you wouldn't be able to see the harsh line, the harsh transition between the sky and the mountain. I want it to kind of fade into that. That's going to help me create a lot of depth. Again, getting variation in this one. I've got the green, now I'm coming back with the black, blending that out just so I've got that soft look. Now I'm using a smaller round brush to just create the hint of palm trees in the distance. There's no real detail. I'm keeping this soft, and I'm going to cover it with a big palm tree anyway, so I'm really wasting my time here. But if you weren't going to put a palm tree and you wanted your hills to show, you could leave this painting would be complete without the palm tree that I'm going to put up front. But if you wanted to leave it like this, you can see I've got variation in my values. Some are darker, some are lighter. I'm smudging that with my finger because again, I want that to stay very soft. And it's really just a line for the trunk and then little smudges on top for where the palm fronds would come out, little lines. And I found some beautiful photos of scenes like this, beach scenes, over on Pixabay. This doesn't come from any one photo. This is probably 6 or 7 different references I was kind of glancing at to get an idea of how I wanted my clouds, how I wanted my mountains to fade in the background, and then how I wanted my water. And part of this is just me making up for my head because I have painted so many beach scenes. So I can't give you one exact reference photo, but you guys are more than welcome to copy this one exactly. And if you do, this is one that if you do want to sell or make prints, you are welcome to do so. I will make a line drawing available for you. I'm going to modify it so that it's more of a rectangle, so it'll be easier for you to fit most of the canvases you're going to be using. But I will put a line drawing or make that available over on my website tomorrow when the video on YouTube goes live. That way, if you want to draw this and you're not really used to getting the shape of the water or the mountains, that will be there for you. It won't have all the teeny tiny detail like this that I'm doing in the background with the palm trees, but it'll at least have the general shapes if you need it. I do ask though, if you do paint this, when you post it online, please give me credit as where you saw the original video or who designed the original painting. Now look at these palm trees. These ones are a little bit more defined. I've got the long stem or the trunk. They look like stems because they're little, but the trunk and then the little palm fronds sticking out. They just kind of droop little half circles or little sad faces kind of. I'm going to soften that just a bit. I added some water with the airbrush, and then I softened it with the mop brush just so that they weren't too harsh, because again, these are in the distance. I don't want these to be too defined. You don't want to try to put as much detail in your background mountains as you do in your foreground. So it's very important that these have the hint of palm trees but still be soft. Again, if you are going to be painting the palm tree up front, I would probably skip most of the detail that I'm doing here. This, I think, is really going to be a waste of time unless you're leaving that palm tree out. This makes me want to paint a bigger, more advanced beach scene after working on this one. I may have to do that in the near future. Now these are going to be the most defined of the mountain palm trees. I'm again starting with the trunk. Notice that they're not just straight lines, they curve. You can have a couple that are straight, but you don't want them all to be straight. It makes them feel very stiff. So they're curved, they're going in different directions. If you're familiar with palm trees, you know they grow in some really weird shapes and they'll angle out weird. So we don't want them to all be perfectly straight and tied up. Or I should say like they were tied up when they grew. So with these ones, I drew, you can see I'm coming back out and putting the palm fronds in there, but I'm being a little bit more definite in how I shape these. Again, because these are up closer, you're going to see that detail more. They've got that slight curve. I don't want them to be too stiff. Now, the type of palm tree that you're painting will make a big difference too. I like these very wispy ones. Those are my favorites. We had those a lot in the areas I lived in Southern California. Love those trees. So mine are all going to have that kind of droopy, wispy feel. But there are palm trees that do have a stiffer look. So make sure, decide which kind you want to paint before you start. So I'm going to put on this one some palm trees that are up a little bit closer. Even though it's still very dark in that area, I still don't want it to feel totally flat like there's only palm trees along the upper ridge. Even though those are the ones that you're going to see more because of them being up against the gray sky, I still want to get some of that texture down here. Again, this is just a round brush. It's a Taklon. This one I don't think is a Taklon, but it has the feel of a Taklon brush. Now I could use an actual liner brush, but here I want this fuzzy look. I don't want these to be too perfectly defined with too much detail, so I'm not using one of my better liner brushes. This brush is slightly damaged, so the bristles kind of fray out a little bit, which is good for what I'm doing right now. Normally, not the look that I want, but for these palm trees, it's good because it creates the look of all of the little detail in one stroke because this brush is so frayed. Getting a few highlights in here. So that is about it for that background. Now I'm going to move on to the sand. Now you may think, well, the sand is closer to you, so shouldn't you paint the water first? The thing is, the sand is under the water. So while the sand may feel, you may think it's closer, paint that after the water. Do the sand first. That way, when you paint the water on top of it, you can get your harsher edge and not have to worry about the fact that your sand blended into that. Because a lot of times when you are blending something like the sand, it may blend over the water and then you have to repaint the water. So I look at the sand as being farther back because it's underneath the water. I've started with a gray mixture, so my titanium white and black, and then I added my raw sienna, raw umber. I should go check. Okay, I stopped being lazy. I checked. It is the raw sienna. I've also added a little bit of a Van Dyke brown into this. So I kind of mix a muddy color here. And really, like I always say for everything else, the color isn't as important as your values, making sure it's light or dark enough. But if I just did raw sienna, it would be too bright, too much of that gold color, which is not what I want. So I need to gray that up, and to gray it up, the easy thing is to mix gray with it. So that would be your Mars Black and Titanium White. The reason I go with Mars Black over the Ivory Black is too translucent, and so it doesn't really give you the gray that you're looking for. Now I'm adding shadows back towards the back and underneath where the water is going to be. I want this to fade to where it gets lighter as it comes forward. And I've just added straight white on top of this while it's still wet. Now you can see, even though I added straight white, it's not actually white. I just really lightened up the paint that was already there. And as I blend, I can blend right into where the water would be. I don't have to worry about that at all because the water is going to cover this up completely. And that is it. You can see it's really easy to paint the sand like that. So now I've mixed my turquoise color. I mixed turquoise by mixing phthalo blue and phthalo green along with white. Now I'm going to want it to be darker in the background. I want it to just kind of fade from the clouds and the mountains up to where what I've got up front. But I'm going to go ahead and block in my base turquoise color first before I worry too much about the shading. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see students use, whether they're painting in oil or acrylic, is not using enough paint on their brush. They'll mix this teeny tiny amount of paint, and that doesn't get you very far, especially with acrylics. Mix more. You don't have time to stop and blend. So if you run out of paint, make sure you're mixing yourself enough. It is better to mix too much and waste it than have ruined the area you're working on because you had to go back and mix more paint. So here I've added some black and more of the green for my background. Again, I want that just to fade into my clouds. So the first portion of the turquoise is still wet. I'm taking a stiff round brush and I'm just going to smudge that up into the clouds. Again, I do not want that harsh line. By keeping that soft in the background, that helps me to create depth in the piece. This is a really simple painting, but it feels like it has a decent amount of depth just because where I'm paying attention to where I want my harsh lines versus my soft lines that fade out in the background. I want to get more of the shadows under the right-hand side here. And again, letting that blend up into my mountains. I'm just using that stiff round brush. There was a little bit of water because it was starting to dry. Tiny bit of water, just so that it blended smoothly up into those. Now you can see these little white dots right there, right under the mountain. I need more paint and more water on my brush. That's that dry brush look that I want to avoid. Anytime you're seeing those white dots, that lets you know more paint, more water. Do not leave the white dots of your canvas showing through. I'm pulling more of that green in there. I want to softly fade that transition from that dark in the background up to lighter up front. And the funny thing is, there is not much detail on here, yet it looks so much more realistic than if I try to go through and get sharp lines and tons of detail. A lot of times when you're trying to get too much detail in the wrong place, you're just making extra work for yourself and you're not making it look any better. So sometimes keeping that very soft and very simple, which can be hard to learn, I totally understand. Blending out acrylics can definitely be a challenge, but once you get the hang of it, it really makes your life a bit easier. So I'm using a stiff round brush here just because that paint was starting to dry a little bit and I want to smudge that out. And this is supposed to be, I believe it's a synthetic hog hair, but it's not a good synthetic hog hair. They're just those really cheap brushes that you get in kits, but I use them a lot for techniques like this for blending. Those don't get rid of your brush strokes very well, but when paint starts to dry, they do help you to move it around if you need to. They also give you a little bit more control than you sometimes will get with your mop brush. Now in these round canvases, this is one by Fredrix. I love their round canvases. I do paint my edges of these. I continue the painting all the way over to the edges because most people are not going to frame this. I know I don't when I hang it. It's a weird size. It's hard to find frames that will fit this. So I just make sure the edges are painted so that it can be hung as is. There are no staples on the side, so it still looks nice just being hung like this. So I've got a slightly lighter turquoise color that I want to blend into the darks. I'm using a synthetic, this is the Filbert, it is the white Taklon bristled brush. White or gold, I don't remember. They're pretty much the same. But the filbert is nice. If you use a flat brush, you're going to have heavier lines where you start and stop each brush stroke. Because of this having the rounded brush tips, it's easier for me to get rid of those lines. Now notice on this water, even though I'm coming at a diagonal, all of my longer lines are completely horizontal. So like I've said before, when we did water, where you've got the long horizontal, short diagonal, long horizontal, short diagonal, that is the same thing here. I'm coming at that angle, but I don't want my lines, those horizontal lines, if I start trying to follow that angle, it's going to make all of the water look lopsided. It just distorts the perspective. So again, notice that those longer lines are horizontal to my back water line, or the sky line. You can see here that turquoise just glows up against that dark cloudy sky. This now, it's pretty obvious now what I was talking about before, where I was saying how putting these colors up against gray just looks so nice. So I'm going to get some sections of white just to lighten this up front even more. Now I want to make sure that any of my brush strokes, if they show, they should look like ripples in the water. So I've got to keep these horizontal. So I'm back to long horizontal, short diagonal, long horizontal, short diagonal. And no matter what kind of water you're painting, if it's a stream or a river, ocean, whatever, this is really going to be the case. Or even if you're painting a landscape that has a road coming down, the majority of your lines are going to be those long horizontal, short diagonal. There are exceptions to that, but for the most part, more often than not, that's going to be the case. So when you're looking at your reference photo, look for those. Now you can do tons of detail on your wave. Again, my focus here was going to be the palm trees, so there was no reason for me to put too much detail there. I just want nice, soft, calm water. So a few hints of these horizontal lines, but I don't need tons. Just adding a little bit more definition there. I'm still using that filbert. I'm just holding it to the side so that I've got control over how thin or thick my line is. And I wanted to make sure that the ripples, or those sections where the water comes out in that background, was a lot smaller than the ones up front. I want those to be bigger sections. Again, going back to your perspective. I'm going to darken that background up a bit. Really focusing on those long horizontal lines. And this water is still all wet. I've not dried it yet. You can see I'm starting to get the ripples in there, but there's still that long horizontal, short diagonal. And you can see where the dark and the light turquoise colors, or aqua colors, whatever you want to call them, are very soft. The transition from one color to another, they're not harsh lines. There's no dry brushing. That's because all of this water is being kept wet. That way, as I add a new brush stroke, it's very much like oil paint, where it just kind of smudges into the color next to it. I can still see the definition of both colors, but it's got that soft, soft transition from one to the next. Okay, so I went ahead and dried that. Now I've mixed my turquoise color, so again, phthalo blue and phthalo green, and I've added a lot of water. This is being done as a glaze. I'm adding the water, the wet section that's still on the sand. And this is going to be the same thing, the long horizontal, short diagonal. Now, I do not want to follow the shape exactly of the main body of water, though. I do want variation in here. So don't feel like, okay, the top line curves, so I need to just follow that. You have to get that variation. It'll look really, really weird and just like a border if you just copy the shape from the one above it. But there's a lot of water. There is no white in this mixture. It is very translucent, so you can still see the sand underneath it. I'm just making it look like the sand is really wet. I'm going to add a bit of a shadow underneath the main portion of the body, the main body of water. Well, it looks like I'm going to let that dry first. I softened it with a mop brush just to get rid of some of my harsher brush strokes. So now I've mixed black with some water. I don't want this to be straight dark black, but I do want to add a bit of a shadow under that main body of water. So I've added my little line. I've taken a clean, stiff, round brush, a very small one, and I'm doing little circles and just kind of smudging that black out. If I were working in oil, I could do that the exact same way. I just wouldn't be in a rush. So I don't want to just line everything all the way through with the black. I want to get the bottom section of all of these little water ripples, but I don't want, if I were to try to like outline the entire wave all the way down, it would start to dry. So that's why I'm working in little sections, being that the acrylic does dry so quickly. And this isn't one where adding the airbrush really helps, because the airbrush is going to put too much water. It's a balance that you've got to figure out. How much water versus how much paint on the one brush, and how wet your brush that you're smudging is. If I've got more water on the brush that I'm applying the paint with, then I want less water on that smudging brush. Adding the shadow under here as well. Now the brush that I'm smudging with, this one here, it is a little damp. A very, very small amount. I basically get it wet and then I try to get all of the water out of it, so it's not perfectly dry anymore. But that's where I'm talking about. You've got to balance out how much water is on your other brush versus this one, and it just takes practice. But having a little bit of water on it, it allows me to smudge it a little bit better. So this is where I'm mixing wet into dry. Meaning the paint on my brush is wet, the sand underneath it is dry, but I'm smudging down into that sand and still getting a soft look. Okay, now I want to add a second section. I've dried this. I want to add an even lighter glaze for the next row of wet paint, or wet sand, I should say. Now this has a lot of water on it, and so it is starting to run, but I need it to be really, really pale. I'm just going to blend that out with my mop brush. And then I'm going to take a hairdryer before it starts to run again, because even though I blended that out, it does start to get kind of grainy if you don't dry it right away. Now, people will always ask me or say they watched that video. Someone made a video talking about how you can't use water, or you shouldn't use very much water when you're painting with acrylics because it makes it, she had a whole science thing about it, but honestly, it's wrong. You absolutely can use water with your paint, your acrylic paints. The thing is, the more water you add, the less adhesive it is, which is not a problem once you varnish it. The only problem is while I'm painting, if I were to take a scrubber brush after that dries, it would be possible that I would start to lift some of that wet water area that I just did, would start to lift off a little bit. By lift off, I mean what I just did came off, not like it's starting to peel and crack on the canvas. That isn't an issue at all. Once this is dry, when the whole painting is done, when I varnish this, I'm going to take a spray varnish and spray it first. If I were to use a regular paint on varnish, some of this would lift off, but once the spray varnish is there, that's going to seal it. That bonds everything together, all those little molecules that the lady in her video was talking about. Oh, it's going to flake and peel. Not once you've got a varnish on it. Once it's varnished, it is totally fine. And the glazing medium just doesn't it's too thick. It doesn't give you the same result. I just really prefer water in almost all cases. So I'm starting to create a little bit of sea foam. I don't want too much here. So I'm softening that out because I went a little crazy. I'm only going to put the sea foam on the main body of water. And normally I will use these stiff brushes to get the little dots, but I found it was giving me more detail than I wanted. So I ended up switching over to a filbert and let these brush strokes be a little bit heavier, just to give you the hint of sea foam without it being so dotted. So what I did is where I kind of went out of the line and smudged where I didn't want it, I took that stiff round brush, that orange one, I've got a little bit of water on it, and I just basically used it like an eraser, erased it from the bottom section where I did not want it on the wet sand. So here I've switched over to that filbert, and I'm just going to make sure that I keep different brush strokes in there. I don't want them all the same. Just going to give a hint of white where that seafoam would be. Now there are so many different ways to make sea foam, and normally I do use that stiff round brush, so I'll show you that again in a future video. But for this one, with it being so small, I just wasn't liking the effect that I got. So we're just going to add hints here. Notice I'm getting lighter and smaller as I work my way back. I'm just going to put a highlight on top of the first row of wet sand here, or wet water. Wet water, that's a bit redundant. Pulling out a little bit of the ripples from that seafoam into the water. Again, mainly keeping these as long horizontal lines. Now, if you're working in oil, you can do this the same way, but you will get to the point where you want to start letting it dry in between some of these layers because you will start to create mud. What I would do with oil is get everything painted, the whole canvas covered with paint, get it as close as possible when it dries, go on top of that. Get it as close to finish as possible, let it dry. Once I start creating mud and things are just smudging together too much, just when you start having that problem with it smudging, that's when you need to let it dry and come back later. A few more of these ripples, again, focusing on the long horizontal, short vertical. It looks like these are vertical. On some of these are kind of at a diagonal. They're not when you see this in person. It's just the angle of the camera. These longer lines really are very, very straight. Now you can use a liner brush if you want to for this section of the wet sand. For me, I'm just barely letting the tip of this brush touch the canvas. It has I shouldn't say it has very little amount of paint because that would create dry brushing, but it doesn't have a glob of paint on the tip of the brush, I should say. Kind of covering up some of that area where I tabbed the brush. Did not like how that came out, so I keep going back and doing little touch-ups. Now again here, I don't want to put too much detail knowing the palm tree is going to cover this, not just because it's going to cover it, but because if I put too much detail, it's going to draw too much attention away from that palm tree. It'll just kind of clash with the amount of detail that the palm tree is going to have. So I'm going to let this dry completely, and I've used my white charcoal pencil and drawn in where my palm trees are going to go. All I draw in are my tree trunks and then the lines of where each palm frond is going to be. I'm going to start with a grayish brown just to get my base for that trunk. I'm using a flat Taklon bristled brush. Remember, if you're getting the little white dots of that canvas, or in this case it wouldn't be white dots, just little dots, it means you need more paint and more water on your brush. While that's still wet, I've taken straight white paint and I'm adding a highlight, and I'm pulling little lines, little kind of half smiles to create the curve of that palm tree. That way it doesn't look flat. Really easy to do. Going to do the same thing on this guy. Now I'm going to want to make a shadow on the other side. And And I don't really have to worry about it being the right perfect color. I even glaze over it to tint the color. I just need to get my values in here. So I've mixed brown with a little bit of black. So I still want kind of a grayish color for this trunk. Being that all of the colors in this are more muted except for the background and of the water and some of the mountains in the background, I don't want to put any of a bold, or wow, great English there. I don't want to put bold, like kind of an orangish brown or anything like that. While that may work on some paintings, for this one, all your attention would just be drawn to these tree trunks. So I want to keep them very, very gray, which is typical of most palm trees. Some will have that reddish tint depending on the reference photo that you're seeing. They can pick up colors from around them, and then of course you've got different varieties of palm trees. But for these ones, even if they had more of a reddish brown in it, I wouldn't choose to use that. It wouldn't fit with this painting. I've got to adjust my color to make sure that overall it looks good with this specific piece. You can see these tree trunks are slightly curved. And I've got them going off the page. That way I don't have to worry about where they kind of are coming out of the sand, because that's a whole other detailed mess. It kind of looks weird when you've got a palm tree coming out of the sand. And so just as far as making it your actual artwork look pretty, usually going off the page looks better. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to let that dry. I'm using that flat brush. I'm going to draw in the individual sections for each palm frond. You can see I've got all of mine slightly curved, or pretty curved actually. Notice that they're overlapping each other too. That's a big deal. You don't want them to all just be sticking out without any overlap. It's not that they all have to overlap each other, but you do have to get a few in there to get that natural feel. Now at this stage, if you're more comfortable working with a liner brush, you can definitely do that. Now once I have my general shape blocked in, I'm going to come back through, and I'm just using straight Mars Black at this point. I'm going to come through and start adding the little hairs off each individual branch here. So I've got these little wisps, and these are also slightly curved, much less so than the actual palm fronds themselves, but see how they're thicker at the base where they start, and then they get kind of scraggly at the tips. You can see I've also got these slightly overlapping each other. Apparently my favorite word today is slightly. But I want to make sure that they feel kind of full and fluffy towards the center of each of these spikes that are sticking out. As they get down towards the outside edge of each palm frond, you can see they get very wispy. I don't want just solid black in there. I want to make sure you can see parts of the background showing through. Now the other thing to notice here, some of these leaves, you're not going to all make all of the palm fronds the same where they're smooth on the top and then fluffy on the bottom. This one, for example, angles at you more, and so you've got fluffy sections coming out of both sections, or both sides of that stem, we'll call it, that I painted in originally. And this is just like how I do other trees, where I first paint it black, then I'm going to layer a lighter green and then a highlight on top of that. I will always use at least 3 colors, black and 2 other shades of green. Sometimes I'll come back through with a third with more, or I should say a fourth shade with highlights, or more highlights. So here's another one where you can see the fluffy areas stick out of both sides just because of the angle of that palm frond. You don't want these to be too perfectly shaped. Variation is a really big deal in making this have a natural feel. You can see I'm letting these overlap each other. That is so, so important. If you don't let anything overlap, it looks too stringy. So doing the same thing on this little guy. You don't notice it as much because he's against that dark mountain, but when I pull the highlights on top, he'll stand out a lot more. I'm going to define this shadow a little bit better now that the first layer dried. I'm going to come back through the opposite direction from the shadowed section in, again with little curves. I don't just want a line of black. I want that to fade in. Now I've let that dry. I've mixed my teal color again, and I'm using the liner brush to line the side of the tree. Like I said last week on the other painting I was doing, I've started doing this a lot, this kind of reflection of water or whatever color is around it with blue on the outline of my darkest portions. It's not an issue of necessarily being correct for the lighting, but I love how it looks. So now I've got to mix that darker green. And again, I'm not that worried about it being the perfect color. I'm going to do this in layers. If I mix something and I hit the canvas, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was bad. I'm just going to put black over it. You're not even going to see it. So don't freak out about, oh my gosh, I can't get the perfect color and I don't think it's right. Just keep playing and keep mixing it. Now here, my greens and the yellows that I'm using to get this green, this is, I believe, Hooker's green with yellow. And it's fairly translucent. That's normal with a lot of the greens and the yellows. I can add a little bit of white to lighten it up later. Because I want this green to be dark, it's okay with me that this green is somewhat translucent. Now notice I'm not covering up all of the black. That is key. You want to make sure some of those black areas that you first painted in are still showing. I'm covering a lot of it, but not all of it, and especially not towards the inside where all of these meet. This guy's got a little bit less detail, being that he's smaller and back further. I don't need as many brush strokes for the green here. Now I'm lightening up a lot of my green here. Instead of using white, I'm using a color by Liquitex Basics called Brilliant Yellow Green. It's like this bright fluorescent green, and it's opaque enough that it really does lighten it up without just getting that foggy white color that you would. Because here I do want a pretty fluorescent green on these trees. So that's the color that I'm using to lighten these with. And I will also be using it by itself for part of the top highlight on these. Now I decided that I went a little crazy with the green, so I'm coming back through with this small round brush and just adding in a bit more of the black. This is a thing you have to remember. It's forgiving. Don't be afraid of it. If you go too crazy with one, you can come back and layer on top of it like what I've done here. And define that highlight a little bit better with the white. Again, notice these little lines are not straight. They're slightly curved. Now I'm going to be taking this bright green and going on top of some of these highlights, but again, I don't want to cover all of the darker green or all of the black. I just want to hit the highlights of some of these. And it's not that this green is necessarily the most natural color. It's an issue of I want bright green because this is going in my living room too. Those are my colors, that lime or brighter green and then this teal. And so that's why I've chosen to go with this color that's more fluorescent than you may want. You can leave this more muted if you want to. If you leave it more muted, you still want it brighter, if that makes sense, or lighter, I should say, but it doesn't have to be fluorescent. If it's too fluorescent for you, add a touch of red and that'll neutralize the color a little bit. Just because red and green being complementary colors, if you've got something that's too red or if it's too green, add its complement and it'll neutralize it so you get a more natural color. You can see that just hitting some of these highlights. Now I'm using that, what did I say it was? The brilliant yellow green on top for the brightest highlights. Oh, too bright. Gonna smudge that out, get a little bit less paint on my brush. I've taken that brush, the liner brush, add a little bit of water so that I could remove some of that bright green. Trying that again. Maybe, or we'll just sit here and look at a there we go. So I'm using the liner brush now. I switched brushes because that was just too much of that bright green. I want that bright green, just not that much of it. It was too thick. So even here, I want to go less than any of the previous layers. Now here again, you can see these are the colors I was talking about. You can see where this green just glows up against that gray background. Between that and the turquoise, you get this glowy feel that you really wouldn't, had I used a blue sky, it wouldn't pop out as much. It can still be pretty, it just wouldn't have that really bold transition between the gray and then these fluorescent colors. I'm going to do the same highlights over here, just a few. I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to cover up all of the darker greens or the black. You can see again, these lines are curved a bit. I've mixed a little bit of that raw sienna in with some white. I'm going to use that for my last bit of highlights. So they're the same colors I used on the sand, just a little bit more white. Now I'm going to take some of my turquoise, just hit the bottoms of some of these palm fronds. Again, that turquoise is the phthalo blue, phthalo green, and white. You notice that my liner brush is pretty long. It's not a teeny tiny little bristle at the tip of the brush. If you want to get really good detail, you want these longer bristled brushes, and you're going to control how thin or thick your line is based on how much pressure you're applying to that brush. Here I am barely letting it touch to get these thin little lines. The lines that are thicker and a little bit heavier, I'm pushing harder. I'm coming back through with a little bit of black where I got a bit crazy with the greens. Again, with the black, I don't want to go crazy either. Just a little bit here and there. Just to make sure I'm keeping that very wispy feel. Now, just to create a bit more shading on the inside of these palms, I'm taking some ivory black, which is very translucent, and washing over all of it. You can still see some of my highlights with the greens. I'm not covering it completely, just in a few spots. I just want to tone a few of these palm fronds down. And the thing is that's so nice with acrylic, if you decide, oh my gosh, I just darkened that too much, go back over it. You can keep layering and keep working all you want. This isn't like colored pencil where you damage the tooth of the paper, you've got too many layers. You can layer as much as you want with your acrylics. And that is it for this one. I will have the line drawing again will be available for you guys tomorrow if you wanted to paint this one yourself. If you have any questions, let me know.